Hi, this is Eric from Cafe Watercolor. Welcome to a new painting demo. Let's jump into it. So this is the first formal painting, I should say, I've done in my new studio. And I'm painting the studio itself, so that makes it extra meaningful. I took a few photos when they have the tractor pulled in my tiny house studio into my backyard, and the lighting in that day is actually quite nice, so I decided to paint it. Because I was busy moving and everything, I actually haven't painted for quite a while, so I did a value study, tried to get myself back into the game. And like I mentioned before, value study is a very good way for you to get your brush wet, just to play around with the paint a little bit, get your groove going so you can stay relaxed because you're not painting a formal color version. This is more like a practice. Get yourself back into making washes, making different values, paint intensity, as well as studying the subject itself. So the first layer of the value study is the middle value. So I didn't paint any of the light, I leave them white. And I tried to connect the whole middle value into one big shape. I connect as much shape as possible so that it'll be easy to read. And already you can start to tell there's a little bit of structure and form going on because it is an optical illusion that when we see light and dark in a specific shape, we start to perceive it as a three-dimensional shape. And if you're a little bit confusing about what in the world is this that I'm painting, that is actually my new studio, my new office space. It is in the form of a tiny house. So if you haven't watched my last video, I strongly recommend you check it out. I share about the story of this tiny house, and I also gave you a tour inside of my new studio. So the second wash of the value study, I start to fill in the dark. So underneath the tiny house, the dark shadow that's casting on the ground, those are more of a occluded shadow. They are very dark compared to the far left. There's a tree casting shadow on the ground. You can actually see that, but because it has more skylight on them, so they're not as dark as the occluded shadow underneath the tractor and the house. So those are the very important thing to notice. And aside from the occluded shadow, the dark wooden color on the siding of the tiny house and some of the black areas on the tractor, those are also dark value as well. And of course, the background trees, there's some dark leaves and the dark tree trunk, those can be dark value as well. I added a figure on the side just for scale reference and make it a little bit more interesting. And now I'm starting to do the color version. The paper is slightly bigger, it's 12 by 16. And also, since it is going to be the final version, the more formal version, I am doing the drawing just a little bit tighter. Start off with a very dull 4B pencil, trying to block the shape down. And I think about the perspective a little bit more. That being said, I didn't measure very precisely, it's still mostly eyeballing. I have to admit that a lot of time I don't have a lot of patience to do the drawing because I want to get to the painting quicker. Because painting is the fun part, the drawing usually is not, but I still try to make it as clean as neat as I can within my tolerance level. Especially because my day job is a digital video game artist, I do a lot of 3D modeling and stuff. So I feel like I want to leave that sort of precise photographic quality to the digital work. For the watercolor, I'll try to stay a little bit loose. Still, I try to make it looking solid instead of way off and looking really stylized and falling apart. So take these two wheels for example, they are small cylinders. So I try to do that and think of it as a three-dimensional object. So I'm using a mechanical pencil, make some cleaner lines so that I can erase some of the messier construction line I did earlier. So that leaves us a cleaner line drawing for me to paint on top. You might also notice that I don't use ruler. I try to do all the lines freehand, and sometimes the line will be a little bit more wobbly, but I feel that it has more energy and more character than if you try to use a ruler or a straight edge. And I remember going to Andy Evenson's workshop, somebody was asking for a ruler, and Andy sort of squints and jokingly have this very serious tone saying ruler, and I was just laughing because Andy's painting style is more loose and painterly, so I'm pretty sure he doesn't use ruler. And I don't think there's anything wrong using ruler, but I feel if you can do lines and stuff freehands, there's just a little bit more energy and a little bit more sense of human touch in your painting. But if you are doing like an architectural painting, something that needs to be very precise, then you can use ruler. That's not something that I'm completely against. At the end of the day, it's your painting, you can do whatever you want. The important thing is to understand perspective and understand scale, because even if your line is not perfectly straight all the time, if you understand perspective and it shows in your drawing, it can still look very believable, and that's what you want, believability, instead of trying to go for like a photorealistic. Now I changed the pose of the person so he is a little bit like directing where the tractor should go. So clean up the line work a little bit, and here we start the first wash. I pre-wet the paper for the background, so mostly the color of the light, such as the sky and the light part of the tree. So I start to paint in the sky and the tree wet onto wet. And you'll see their colors sort of blend together, and that's totally fine. This is just the color of the light. And actually in the first wash, you do want to have a little bit of wet on wet softness there. So it'll kind of feel like there's slight blooming, and that's how you get a nice sense of this transparency in watercolor. And the more important thing for the first wash is to have a clean wash. So don't get stuck in the detail, don't try to paint around the light too much, it's not really necessary. So the only place that I leave some white is actually just the side of the tractor because it's white paint, and as well as some of the text in the back because I'm painting orange on it. So I do want to preserve a little bit of the white text in the back of the tractor. And everything else I try to just have a nice light value wet onto wet. And this is where the value study helps, because if you did value study before this, it already kind of got you into the mindset of making washes and try to loosen up and just put paint on the paper. So I can't say enough good things about value study, so I'm really thankful for Andy Evenson sharing his process of painting with us. So this has become part of my usual painting process. Now I do this in real time so you can kind of see the speed that I'm painting. I am painting the second wash, so I started from the background tree. And as you can see, as loose as I'm trying to indicate those trees, I didn't paint really that fast because I try to give it some thought before I put down each brushstroke. And oftentimes I'm trying to make the decision that should I put down this brushstroke or not, because overpaint is very common issue for a lot of painters, including myself. So a lot of time I'm trying to make decision whether I should paint a specific brushstroke or not. So quote Hamlet with a little bit of twist, to paint or not to paint, that is the question. And I really come with experience and trials and errors, because sometimes you might paint too much and the overall painting looks too busy, and sometimes you paint too little and there's not enough information for the viewers to get what you're painting. So there's always that balance whether to paint or not to paint. And I think after a couple of years of practice, I do have a pretty decent grasp, but sometimes I still feel like, yeah, there are a couple brushstrokes I probably don't need to paint. I try to do a little bit too much because I thought it can look better, so I paint another brushstroke, then another one, and then it start to look a little bit too busy and not as fresh. So anyways, I continue the wash down and I starting to paint the tiny house. Now it's the middle value. So that's the first wash of the value study. I will paint darker value later, so you don't have to go into too dark too soon. Because you can always paint darker, lay more layers on top. It might not look as fresh, but you can do it. But if you paint too dark too soon, it's pretty hard to lighten things up later. You can lift later, but it's usually not going to look that good. So here I'm trying to change up the color temperature a little bit. So instead of a cool gray, I add a little bit more warm color. So there is a little bit warm and cool within that middle value. It's pretty subtle and you can probably barely notice it, especially after it is dry. But it's a good thing to do while you are still making your wash, just to have a little bit more color variation. And that's the fun for watercolor. While it is still wet, you can play around with it, add some more color, wet onto wet, and see the color blend in with each other in a very natural way. So I continue that wash to the light side. So the wooden part of the light side of the house is still has a little bit of value. So I have it as part of the middle value. And there's also that very faint shadow casted by the tree in the far left outside of the picture. But you do see the shadow on the ground and also on the tiny house. So I want to paint those in just to give it some more sense of lighting and also make it a little bit more fun to look at. So continue down, started to paint the wheels. And again, some of the areas I'm going to go over that again on the third wash, painting the dark. So as long as you have that plan in your mind, you can be very confident when you're painting. So a solid plan gives you confidence because even if it doesn't look that good right now, you know that the plan is not finished yet. So it can still look better after you continue your plan. And the more you paint, the more you understand if your plan works or not. So with a solid plan and a little bit of experience, it can really help you to make your painting look good. So now I'm starting to paint the figure. So I try to give it a little bit of the value as I paint. So he's wearing like a navy shirt. So the whole shirt is middle value, even though there is light hitting on the shirt. But because the local color is navy, it's actually completely in middle value. And we can add some dark value later when we are painting our next layer. So understand what should be in middle value and what should be in the light value is very important. Just because the light is hitting something doesn't mean that it is light value. If the local color is darker, it can be just middle value. So I continue the wash down, the background trees and bushes, and now down to the ground. And here I'm starting to paint the shadows of the tree on the ground. Try to connect that to rest of the middle value. So you can already get some sense of lighting right now. And that's the powerful thing about just having some value contrast. You can immediately starting to tell the direction of the light and the structure of things. And now I'm starting to paint the dark values. So you can see that as soon as I put in some dark on the navy shirt, you can starting to tell the lighting and the form. So start to work on the background a little bit. There are some dark values in the background, but I try to minimize those, and I try not to make too much contrast in the background because I want them to be pushed back. So there are some areas that I did a little bit of wet onto wet when I paint the second layers, but I try to keep the background mostly in the middle and the light value. So now I started to paint the tractor. It is a little bit of hassle to paint the tractor because there's quite a bit of detail in here. And I'm trying to make it as clean as possible because we want to preserve some of those nice bright orange because that's like a hot spot in this painting. And if we make it too messy, it's going to look dirty. Here I'm starting to add some more dark details on the side of the tractor. So I'm also starting to connect that to the occluded shadow underneath the tractor. Now when I'm painting this tractor, actually when I'm painting this scene, the memory flooded back to me, like the day how they pulled a tiny house with the tractor slowly into the backyard. And I think painting something is always a good way to revisit that memory and relive it again. And even though this is not a spectacular subject like a scenery in Paris or anywhere in Europe where you have very beautiful architecture and stuff, this is just next to my house, my way to the backyard and around the neighborhood, and it's a tractor in a tiny house. It's not particularly a very attractive and quote-unquote beautiful subject, but it's very meaningful and personal. So adding some more dark values, some dark details on the tiny house, the dark shadow casted by the roof. So that just adds a little bit more details and that makes the light brighter as well. So now I'm painting the dark side of the house so that really makes the light side pops out a lot more. And at this point, it's time to do some minor adjustment. Like the dark side of the house, I do want it to be a little bit darker, so I will just add a little bit more transparent wash on top of it, just so that it looks a little bit darker. I'm gonna also add the reflection in the window, so I feel like it's reflecting the environment around it. And start to fill the background back in as well. So that dark bushes, those dark trees, that actually helps the light side of the house pops out even more. So this scene, even though again it's not a spectacular subject, the lighting and the shape actually makes it look very nice and interesting. So sometimes when you pick a subject, don't necessarily pick the obvious beauty. Oh, it's a beautiful buildings, that's why it should be a good subject. Sometimes it's the shape itself or it's the composition, the combination of the value that can make this subject very interesting to paint. So look for good shapes instead of always looking for obvious beauty. And you might surprise that there's a lot of things around you that can be a good painting subject. And that opens up a lot more possibilities for you. And nowadays, I actually prefer something simple but with good shapes and lighting because I think that can actually make more interesting painting. Something very ordinary but also offers a lot of visual impacts. So I come back with a little bit of whitewash just to fill back some light detail in. And here is the finished painting. I hope you enjoy this painting, and I certainly enjoy painting my new studio. And again, if you haven't watched the video where I give you the tour of my new studio, definitely go check that one out. That one is very fun. I'm Eric from Cafe Watercolor, and I will see you again next time.